Hi, I'm Melissa Chalker, Executive Director of the New Jersey Foundation for Aging. Welcome to Aging Insights. Aging Insights is a production of the New Jersey Foundation for Aging. NJFA's mission is to improve aging in New Jersey and help older adults live in the community of their choice. Aging Insights is supported through sponsorships and viewer donations. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please go to our website at www.njfoundationforaging.org or call us in the office at 609-421-0206 for more information. Today we'd like to talk about a specific population, LGBT older adults. We will review some history, policy changes, and the importance of inclusiveness and what providers can do to help. Our guest today has been working on these issues and has even conducted some research with seniors. Carolyn Bradley joins us today to review the obstacles, needs, and resources for this community. Carolyn, welcome and thank you for joining us on Aging Insights. We're really pleased to have you.
Thank you for having me.
If we could start out just by giving a little bit of brief introduction of yourself and the work that you do. I understand you're with Monmouth University, is that correct?
Yes. I'm Carolyn Bradley. I'm an associate professor of social work in the School of Social Work at Monmouth. Where I'm also the MSW program director. I have a doctorate in social work from Fordham University, which is also where I got my master's. And I've been faculty, full-time faculty at Monmouth for the last 14 years.
And I understand through that experience in academics, you've done some research, which we'll get to at some point in the show. But if we could start out by explaining to our audience, because not everyone might be familiar, what we mean when we say LGBT.
Okay. LGBT is an acronym, and it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So the community has really experienced some challenges earlier on. Things are moving in a more positive direction at this point, both legally and socially. Yeah,
and I want to explore that a little bit with you because as we talk specifically about older adults in that community, we have to understand the obstacles and needs of that community is really shaped by the history in our country for this population. So could you tell us a little bit about what that struggle might have been like?
It's interesting that we're talking about this topic because in June we'll celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in New York, okay? In 1969, in June of 1969, the LGBT community really decided it was time to come out of the closet. And they did it in a very dramatic way by actually taking on the police who had come to raid the Stonewall Bar on Christopher Street in New York. And that has now become a National Historical Site. And there's a park across from the Stonewall, which is still open, that commemorates that event. Prior to the push for LGBT civil rights initiated dramatically by the Stonewall riots, there had been smaller groups like the Madison Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, who had also pushed for recognition of LGBT people as just that, people, and not pariahs, not part of society that should be excluded or discriminated against. Stonewall brought that issue to the forefront very dramatically. Since that time, we've seen gains in civil rights. We've even seen gains within the psychiatric and mental health community because up until the early 70s, homosexuality was still considered a psychiatric disorder. And people could be hospitalized, they could undergo shock treatment, they could undergo lobotomies in an attempt to try and change their sexual orientation. So there's a long history of fear of the police, fear of what should be considered helping organizations such as mental health and psychiatry within that community.
And, you know, it's just as important it is to recognize those leaders of those movements that brought about the social and political change, policy change that you've talked about. You know, it's also good to recognize, as we're going to talk about, that this really impacts the ability of older adults in this community to reach out for services because we have to view it through the lens of what they've experienced in their lives because of those battles.
Definitely,
correct?
Definitely. Yeah. So, again, as people age, and they begin to recognize the need for some type of service, people of the pre-Stonewall generation, shall we call them, remember those problems around discrimination and the irony is the people that really push the closet door open are now going back into the closet as it's time to access services.
Sure, and we might not recognize, as people who want to serve all older adults in our state or in our community, we want to have our doors open for them, and so we don't necessarily always understand that someone coming in from the LGBT community might be afraid to identify themselves as being part of that community because they're afraid of stigma or shame, and so, as you said, they're reverting to go back in the closet. What are some negative impacts of that upon them trying to access services in that frame?
From the research, and both national research done by SAGE, which is a national advocacy group for older LGBT adults, and the more local research that we did out of Monmouth, what we found is it creates isolation, and it creates a delay in accessing services, where older adults in the heterosexual community might more willingly begin to look at, okay, maybe I need some home health aid services, maybe I need to get somebody in to help me with cleaning. Older LGBT adults will delay for as long as possible because they are concerned about who's coming into my home, how will I be treated. Your home should really be your safest space, okay? And from the stories we collected when we were doing the research, LGBT older adults found if they didn't, straighten up the house, okay, put away pictures, put away books, put away magazines, sometimes they were challenged by the people who were supposed to be actually providing them help.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, and I want to, as we have our conversation, get into not only the research you've done, but also what providers can do to better train staff and make sure that those sort of things don't happen. But before we get into that, I do want to make sure we talk about the civil rights changes and the policy changes that have occurred that you've already referenced. What are they, and how have they had a positive impact on the LGBT community and older adults, maybe more specifically?
New Jersey is really one of the better states to live in, okay? If you're a older LGBT adult, okay? There's a lot of positive legislation here in New Jersey. We've had a gay civil rights law in New Jersey for a while. There's a trans civil rights law in New Jersey. So there are protections in terms of housing, accessing care and services, things of that nature. Nationally, the Marriage Equality Act certainly created a better financial situation for LGBT older adults. But what we're watching, if you're paying attention, is certain states enacting their own legislation. States like Texas just enacted legislation that says healthcare providers can deny care to LGBT people based on religious beliefs. We've seen similar laws like that enacted on a state-by-state basis throughout the United States. So we're watching a turn, okay? And that's something we're going to have to pay closer attention to.
Right, and just with any, progress that we make for any community, we have to be very aware of where policy changes occur, and the fact that states have, distinct policies they can make on their own. And so it's important for advocates and others to remain aware of what the rights are for people in each state and how we can help, right?
Yes.
And so I appreciate you sharing that sort of information with us and that piece of it.
The important thing, though, to recognize, even though there is marriage equality, a lot of pre-Stonewall older adults choose not to get married because they don't see that as a necessity within this particular community. Younger people, 60 or younger, you'll see more people in that age range possibly going for marriage. So it still creates problems in terms of if someone chooses not to get married, then there are the issues around transfer of property, okay, upon death. There's issues in terms of access, health care, in terms of who will make your decisions for you. So there are still, legal issues for the older LGBT community that often need to be explored with them in terms of advance directives, power of attorney, making sure both names are on deeds for property that are jointly owned. So it's not a clear-cut issue.
Yeah, and so, as we talked a little bit, around the idea of healthcare and accessing, both psychiatric services as well as just in general social services, we also have to remember kind of these legal issues. And, I think it's important for any couple to talk about and have those conversations. And we've done a lot of work on this show about educating people about how to plan for, have healthcare proxies and advanced directives. And so that's so important. But at the same time, with the LGBT older adults, it's probably even more so important because of other legal issues for them to really understand what documents they should have and how they can protect themselves, correct?
Well, yes, because if you don't have those documents in place and you're not married, the person you may have lived with for 25, 30 years who loves you and who has cared for you is not going to be the person who makes those final decisions for you medically. So
yeah, it becomes a challenge. And
yes.
So I hope that, through this show we can bring awareness to that, but also that there are providers out there who are trying to reach this population and educate them about the available resources.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah. That's great. So as we think about the history and the the reluctance of people to seek services because of the history and the barriers that they face, what are and so let's transition, I guess, to talk about your research specifically. Okay. So what is it that you've worked on research-wise with this community, and how has it kind of made an impact on what we know?
Okay, we started out starting the LGBT older adult project at Monmouth University in 2012. And it was the result of having seen a documentary called Gen Silent, which is, I believe, available now on YouTube and is very, very well done, very interesting. And what we were looking at is that was shot in an urban area. It was shot in the Boston area. So we were interested in seeing, are the issues that they're experiencing in an urban setting, how do they play out in a more suburban area, like Monmouth, Ocean, and Middlesex County, which is where we conducted the research. And we wanted to see if people were experiencing the same problems in terms of how your sexual orientation influences the aging process. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And some of the things that we found were, first of all, the legal challenges. Then we were looking at healthcare disparities, that does being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender impact the health issues that you experience, and is your care impacted by the lack of knowledge of healthcare providers around the uniqueness of being within that sexual minority? And some of the things we found was that, first of all, the community is unaware of the health issues that are different based on sexual orientation, and that there's little to no education within the medical community around the uniqueness of LGBT health issues. When we were doing a training with a group of nurses, and we started the training, and the nurses had been told that they were attending this, one of the first questions one of the nurses asked was, what does LGBT mean? Okay, and this is 2017, we were probably doing this training. So that lack of awareness within the medical community was really kind of shocking. The first study within the medical community of LGBT healthcare disparities was in 2011, okay? And when they did that research, they said there is no body of knowledge for this community, and that we're just starting to understand. And there hasn't, when you really do a lit search, there's not a lot that has really come forward since that time. So part of it is educating both the consumer and educating the provider.
Right, and I think that's a really important piece, that we want to make sure we cover both what consumers can do to understand their rights, and what providers can do to make people more comfortable in accessing services. So with your research, it really intrigues me that, it resulted in training, and as I said, I want to cover that part, but how did you go about finding seniors to interview, and what sort of things did you ask them?
Well, the first thing we did was go to the Pride Festival in Asbury Park, which is always the first Sunday in June.
Pride Festival is a gathering
Yes.
people in the LGBT community to come together and celebrate.
Right. And in New Jersey, it's always in Asbury Park the first Sunday in June. So we went to the Pride Festival and we set up a booth and we tried to get people to sign up to give us a mailing list that we could then access, because we explained we were going to be doing research. We were interested in gathering their opinions. It was very interesting. We had, you know, T-shirts that said LGBT Older Adult Project, had a big rainbow on them. And the lesbians would come up and sign up, and they were very interested and they wanted to talk to us, but we weren't getting very many gay men. So we had a BSW student with us who was a young gay man, and we said, you know, why don't you go out into the crowd with a clipboard, see if you can get people to give us some information. And he was like, you know, he'd go out into the crowd, the lesbians would see him, would come up and be like, you know, what are you doing? We'll sign up. He was like, as soon as you started walking to a group of gay men, he was like, they went that way. Okay? And so it's interesting because you find that across the board in studies. Gay men are much less likely to acknowledge aging. Okay? And they're less likely to be prepared to age. The lesbians will have, you know, their investment portfolio in place. They've got their power of attorneys. Okay, they've got their living wills, they've got their wills, okay, everything is in place. The gay men are much less prepared, and so we were interested in trying to find out why. So we started asking that as a direct question, you know, what preparations have you made? If you have not made any preparations, can you share with us why you have not? And it was kind of poignant. A lot of them who were of that pre-Stonewall or just around Stonewall said, I never thought I'd live this long because all of my friends died in the epidemic. Okay? True. They lost so much of their social network to the AIDS epidemic that they didn't think they needed to prepare. So there's a lot more catch-up work to be done with the men.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you started to learn things before you even started to ask the questions, right? Just in trying to gather people to participate in the study, you were learning lessons.
Just through observation, it's like, okay, how come the women are so willing to come forward, and what's going on with the men?
And did you learn anything surprising about the reasons behind reluctance to seek services that you know, or did you really learn the things you expected to hear in that area?
In terms of the consumers, we learned what we thought we were going to learn. In terms of the providers, it was a little different. The consumers are concerned because of historically how the community has been treated. And they're really worried that at the time that they're most vulnerable, as they age and they feel less able to really care for themselves, are they going to be mistreated? Okay? With the providers, it's like there's this hidden population and nobody's even thought that there's this group out here, and that if they are out there, well, why are their needs any different from heterosexuals?
And so in your research, you did a survey not only with consumers but also with providers. And how was the process for seeking out providers? Did you find that there were any particular provider groups that were reluctant to participate, or? Well,
first of all, you had to convince the providers there was a necessity to participate. Okay? We started out by having a graduate student compile a list of agencies serving older adults in Monmouth, Ocean, and Middlesex County, and those included senior centers, Department on Aging, home health care agencies, things like that, any feeding programs in the area. And then we had the graduate student call and ask to talk to either an executive director or the director of social work services and ask 3 questions. Do you have any LGBT older adults that are consumers of your service? Do you have any LGBT staff? And do you have any LGBT specific services? Okay, and we were told no to all 3 questions. Wow. Okay. And when we asked, you know, how do you know this? They said, well, nobody's come forward to to, self-identify. And we asked, well, do you see a necessity of having either specific services or staff trained or out staff? And the response was, no, we treat everybody the same.
I was going to say, do you think it was a result of the providers feeling like, well, anybody can come here, everybody comes here, and not a need to have them identify themselves?
Yes, and to me that's like saying I don't see color.
Right.
Okay, because I then miss a whole significant part of that person's life experience, and I deny that person's experience is any different. And to me, it shows a lack of understanding of how certain characteristics over which you have no control define the experience that you have.
Right. And so, as a result, obviously, there've been instituted some training opportunities for providers. Did you find that people were willing to participate in those, or did it take some convincing?
Actually, no. For the most part, since we were offering it for free, the university was basically underwriting the cost. Most of the agencies that we offered it to were like, sure, okay.
And so what kind of things did you go over in the training? What type of points do you give providers on how to better accept this population?
We've developed a sensitivity training curriculum. It can be delivered in an hour and a half, 3 hours, or we can do a 6-hour training. And what we look at is what we call, LGBT Alphabet 1, okay, where we go over what each of the letters, and we'll expand that out when we do it. So it'll be LGBTQ+, okay, and go over all of that. Then we'll look at the history of the community and why the community is unique. And then we go over the issue of healthcare disparities, what you need to know, what you need to look for, what are the questions that need to be asked. Then we look at the legislation, the civil rights issues, the current legal issues, which is changing on a daily basis, state by state. And then we really spend time saying, okay, let's look at your agency's policies and procedures. Let's look at your forms. How do you give a signal that this is a safe place? Because people aren't going to disclose if they don't feel that they're safe.
And what are some ways then that providers can make themselves known as someone who's going to be sensitive? Or
It's really very simple. I mean, it's as simple as putting a pride flag on your website. It's as simple as showing same-sex couples, sitting together. Where all you see are pictures of heterosexual couples, then the question is there any room for me? Okay? When you look at the forms, recognize that not everyone is going to be married, so you could put partnered on your form. Okay, so there's very simple things. When we do the longer training, we ask people, bring some of your agency paperwork and let's talk about what your agency has. Yeah.
I think that's really great, and I think oftentimes it's not so much that providers aren't willing to be inclusive and to make people comfortable, but they're just not aware. And so the fact that training is available, I think, is really an important part of it. But not only can providers do things, but consumers themselves. So what things would you like for LGBT older adults watching to know that they can do as consumers to protect their rights and understand what their rights are?
Well, there's a couple things. One of the first things is trying to understand the importance of letting your healthcare provider know who you really are. Okay? And when we were collecting stories, some people have had really bad experiences with that, where when they did come out to their doctor immediately put gloves on. Okay? Or told a lesbian about how high risk she was for HIV and AIDS. Now, granted, there is HIV and AIDS in the community, but in the lesbian community, the percentage is very low. Okay, so it's the ignorance of the medical community.
And the fact that he might not have educated any woman coming to him about that versus someone who identified as a lesbian.
Yeah. Right. And if you had on your intake form a question about sexual orientation, then you might be less likely to ask that person, a lesbian, about what are you using for birth control. Okay, which is often, for a lesbian, that's like, okay, that's a really difficult question because it already tells me you don't really understand me, okay? So it's looking at those kind of issues, but it's trying to get the community to be more forthcoming in who they are and demanding that regardless of what my sexual orientation is, I deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And if they're not, then being willing to take it up the complaint ladder, okay? Advocate for yourself in those situations. And because New Jersey has civil rights laws, it's a safe place to actually try and do that.
I think that's a great place for us to end in letting our audience know that you should always be a self-advocate and always look out and understand what your rights are and to seek that information out. It's out there in the public, right?
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you, Carolyn, for joining us. Really appreciate the information that you've shared with us today.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for watching this episode of Aging Insights. For more information and to watch previous episodes, please go to our website at www.njfoundationforaging.org and click on our Aging Insights page. Aging Insights is produced by the New Jersey Foundation for Aging and is made possible by sponsors and donations from viewers like you. To become an Aging Insights sponsor, please go to our website or call us in the office at 609-421-0206. And to find out about senior services in your area, please contact your county office on aging. Their numbers can also be found on our website, or you can call the state hotline at 1-877-222-3737. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in next time.